Welcome back to Lantern Lake Stories. Get comfortable. Blanket a little closer. Tonight's story is about a woman who came back to a place she swore she'd never return to. And the night the old lighthouse came back to life on its own. The light swept across the water at exactly 12 minutes past midnight. Nobody could explain it. And Clara, sitting alone in her car, rain on the windshield, was the only one who saw it. For just that moment, she was 9 years old again. And her father was still alive. Let's begin. The rain started just after she crossed into Vermont, where the highway narrowed and the trees closed in like old friends leaning in to whisper. Clara hadn't planned it that way. She hadn't planned much of anything about this trip. She'd left Boston at 11 in the morning with one bag, cold coffee, and no real answer for why she was doing this. Her sister had called 3 times, her editor twice. She'd let all of them go to voicemail and pointed the car north. The GPS had taken a long moment to process when she plugged in the address from memory. It blinked at her the way things blink when they aren't sure you've made a good decision. Then it told her to take the next exit in 4 miles. She'd taken it. Millhaven, Vermont. Population, 1,400, maybe less now. The kind of town that looks exactly the same in photographs from 50 years ago, except the faces have changed and some of the storefronts have different names. She hadn't been back long enough to know what else had changed. The last time she'd driven this road, she'd been going the other direction. Away, fast, with the radio turned up loud enough that she couldn't hear herself think, which was exactly the way she'd needed it. Now she was going the other way, and the radio was off, and there was nothing but rain and the dark and the sound of her own breathing and the soft percussion of water against glass. The town appeared the way it always had, gradually and then all at once. First the feed store, then the old Methodist church with its white steeple gone slightly gray, then the amber glow of the street lamps on Main Street reflecting in puddles, and the wooden sign that read Welcome to Millhaven, a place where time takes its time. Someone had painted a small bluebird on the sign sometime since she'd last been here. She noticed that. She drove slowly through Main Street. No one was out. It was close to midnight, and Millhaven had always gone to bed early. The diner was dark. The hardware store was dark. But the little bookshop, Reedy's Books and Maps, had a single lamp burning in the back window. Either old Walt Reedy had fallen asleep in his reading chair, or nothing in this town ever really turned its back on the dark. She turned left at the end of Main Street, crossed the narrow bridge over Miller Creek, and followed the lake road south. The lake appeared between the trees as it always had, in glimpses first. A flash of black water, a slice of silver where the sky reflected off the surface. And then the road curved and the trees thinned, and there it was. Mirror Lake. That was its actual name on the county maps. But nobody in Millhaven had ever called it that. They called it Lantern Lake because of the old tradition. On the first night of summer every year, the families who lived along the shore would float paper lanterns across the water, and the whole surface would glow orange and gold like something alive, and people would come from 3 counties over just to stand on the bank and watch. Clara remembered that tradition very well. She remembered standing in the water up to her knees at age 7, holding a lantern made from wax paper and a wire frame, feeling the warmth of the tiny candle inside against her palms, watching it float away from her fingers and join the hundreds of others already drifting across the black water. She remembered her father standing beside her. She had to stop driving for a moment after that memory arrived. She sat in the car with her hands in her lap and waited for the feeling to pass. Passed. They always passed, eventually. She sat in the quiet and watched the rain come down and looked out at the lake. That was when the light happened. And on that promontory, dark for as long as Clara could remember, broken and boarded up, a skeleton of what it had once been, stood the old lighthouse. The Ashford Lighthouse, named for her family, built by her great-grandfather in 1891, decommissioned in 1994, the year her father died. The light swept across the water once, slow and golden, like the beam of a lantern held by someone searching for something lost. It moved across the surface of the lake and then it was gone. The lighthouse went dark again. The rain came down. Clara sat very still for a long time, Then she started the car, and she drove toward it. The house was still there. Of course it was still there. Houses don't disappear just because you need them to. They stand and they wait and they hold the shape of everything that ever happened inside them. Patient as stones. The Ashford family home sat just back from the lighthouse, tucked into old pine trees that had grown even taller. The house was weathered gray-blue, 2 stories, with a wide porch and dark green shutters. Her father had painted one August when she was 11. She remembered handing him the brushes. She remembered the smell of the paint and the sound of him humming. The porch light was on. That was strange. Clara sat in the car at the end of the driveway for a moment, just looking at the house. There was no other car here. No sign of anyone. She'd spoken to the property management company in Burlington 2 weeks ago, when her mother's estate had finally, after 3 years of delays, been settled and the property transferred fully into Clara's name. The woman on the phone had been pleasant and efficient, and had told Clara that the house was empty and had been since her mother passed, and that the power was still connected because the management company paid the minimum monthly bill to keep the pipes from freezing in winter, and that Clara was welcome to take possession whenever she was ready. Clara hadn't told anyone she was coming tonight, and yet the porch light was on. She got out of the car. The rain had softened to a mist now. The smell of the lake came to her immediately, that particular combination of pine resin and clean water and something deeper, more mineral, like stone that has been wet for 1,000 years. She walked up the porch steps. They creaked, the third one, always the third one. That was the one her mother had always meant to fix and never had. Clara stepped over it out of old habit and felt a sudden, sharp lurch of emotion at the fact that her body still remembered. The front door was locked. She had a key. She'd had it for years, had carried it on her keychain as a kind of talisman without ever quite letting herself examine why. She turned it in the lock and the door swung open and the smell of the house came to her. The front hallway filled with warm amber light. One of the bulbs in the fixture had burned out, so it wasn't as bright as it should have been, but it was enough. The hardwood floors were dusty but intact. The coat hooks by the door were empty. She carried her bag inside and closed the door against the mist. She moved slowly through the downstairs, turning on lights as she went. The kitchen. Still the same pine cabinets, the old iron sink, the window over it that looked out toward the lake. The dining room. The long table still there, 6 chairs around it. The sitting room. The stone fireplace, the bookshelves either side of it, still full of books she'd read as a child. She trailed her fingers along the spines as she passed. Agatha Christie, Steinbeck, A Field Guide to Vermont Birds, a worn copy of Little Women with a library stamp inside the front cover that had been there since her grandmother's childhood, kept so long past due that the concept of returning it had become a family joke. She walked to the window that faced the lake. The water was dark and still out there, glinting faintly in the mist. The old lighthouse stood at the end of the promontory, dark now, just a silhouette against the slightly lighter sky. She hadn't imagined it. She was certain of that. The light had swept across the water. She stood there looking at it for a long time. Then she went upstairs, found the linen closet where the sheets had always been kept, made up the bed in the room that had been hers as a child, narrow, sloped ceiling on one side, one window facing the lake, and lay down fully dressed on top of the quilt. She meant to think about the lighthouse, about the light, but the rain came back, soft and steady against the window, and the house settled around her with that particular sound old houses make when they're glad to have someone in them again. And before she could think about anything at all, Clara Ashford was asleep. She woke to birdsong, not the city kind, the brave, defiant sparrows and pigeons of Boston, shouting their existence over traffic. The real kind, layered and unhurried, a whole conversation happening in the trees outside the window, as if the birds had been talking all night and she'd simply woken up in the middle of it. She lay still for a moment, looking at the ceiling. The light in the room was that particular early morning quality, pale gold, slightly diffuse, coming through curtains that were so old the cotton had gone almost translucent. Outside, the birdsong continued. Somewhere, a woodpecker was trying to tell somebody something important. She went to the window and looked out. The lake in the morning was a different creature entirely from the lake at night, where the night lake was dark and mysterious and held things in its depths. The morning lake was expansive, luminous, almost impossible in how blue it was. The mist had cleared. The surface shimmered with 1,000 small movements. Wind, fish, the landing footprints of birds. On the far shore, the tree line was a dense wall of green that reflected back into the water so clearly it was sometimes hard to tell where the trees ended and their mirror image began. And the lighthouse, in the morning light, looked smaller than she'd expected. Older. The white paint had long since peeled away to reveal the gray granite beneath. The iron railing around the lamp room was dark with rust. The windows were cloudy with decades of weather. It stood at the end of the rocky point like something that had decided to stop pretending. She watched it for a moment. It did not light up in the morning. She went downstairs, found that the kitchen faucet still worked. The water ran rust-colored for a minute, then cleared, and filled a pot to heat on the old gas stove. There were no coffee grounds in the house, naturally, but she found a tin of loose-leaf tea in the back of the cabinet that was probably 5 years old and smelled faintly of something that might once have been chamomile. She made a cup and stood at the kitchen window and drank it and watched the lake. She was going to need food. And coffee. Real coffee. And coffee. Going into town meant being seen. Being seen meant being recognized. Being recognized meant the conversation she had been avoiding for 14 years. Clara Ashford. My goodness. We heard you were in the city. How long has it been? We've missed you around here. Your mama talked about you so often. That last one was the one that would undo her, if she let it. She finished her tea. She washed the cup in the iron sink and left it upside down on the drain board. Then she went back upstairs, changed into clean clothes from her bag, ran a brush through her hair, looked at herself briefly and without particular interest in the bathroom mirror, and went back downstairs and out the front door. The morning air was extraordinary. Cool and pine-scented and so clean after the recycled air of the apartment and the car that it almost felt like something you could hold in your hands. She stood on the porch and breathed it for a moment with her eyes closed. Then she heard the sound. A soft, rhythmic sound, coming from the direction of the lighthouse. Hammering. She walked down the slope of the yard toward the water, through the long grass that had grown knee-high in her absence, wet with dew against her jeans. The ground was uneven under the grass. She remembered that, had turned her ankle here once as a child and sat crying in the grass while her father came running. She picked her way carefully across the old familiar terrain. The rocky path to the lighthouse promontory was still there, just barely, overgrown at the edges but the stones still clear underfoot. She followed it around the curve of the shore and out onto the point. The lighthouse, up close, was both more and less imposing than she'd expected. Less because she could see all its weathering and its ruin, the boarded lower windows, the door hanging slightly off its upper hinge, the weeds that had pushed up through the cracks between the stones at the base. More because it was still, despite all of that, unmistakably a lighthouse. Unmistakably a thing built with intention and pride and the specific human desire to say, "There is light here. Follow it. You will be safe." A man was on the far side of the base, kneeling on the rocks with a toolbox open beside him and a length of old copper pipe in one hand. He was perhaps 50, lean and long-limbed, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of deeply weathered face that comes from decades of outdoor work. He wore canvas work pants and a faded green flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and he was examining the pipe with the focused expression of someone who has been in conversation with a difficult problem and is getting close to a resolution. He looked up when he heard her footsteps on the rock. They looked at each other for a moment without speaking. His eyes were a very light gray blue, the color of the lake on an overcast day. Something in his face shifted when he saw her. Not alarm, not surprise exactly. More like recognition. Clara Ashford. "I'm sorry." He did. The lighthouse, up close, was both more and less imposing than she'd expected. He set down the pipe and stood, wiping his hands on his pants. He held out his hand. She shook his hand. She stared at him. She couldn't quite place him, not with 30 years of age on his face. But there was something familiar in the line of his jaw, in the way he tilted his head slightly to one side. Something clicked into place. Owen Marsh. Quiet kid. He always been reading something. The time he caught a frog in the schoolyard and released it by the creek instead of showing it around like the other boys. The eraser. Yes, actually, she probably had borrowed it. She shook his hand. His grip was firm and unhurried. I'm sorry, I almost didn't recognize you. 30-some years will do that. You live nearby. The old caretaker's cottage, just back in the trees there. He nodded once, as if this confirmed something he'd already understood. I didn't know that, she didn't tell me. Your mother was private about some things. The light last night, did you see it? I saw it. Can you explain it? By any reasonable account, that light should not have been able to function. But it did. He picked up the piece of pipe again, turned it in his hands. There's a historical preservation grant. The town applied for it last year. The lighthouse is going to be a heritage site. Because of the family. Because of the history. She looked at the lighthouse for another long moment. The morning sun was touching the top of it now, and the old stone caught the light in a way that made it look, briefly, almost golden. Do you know when it was last working? She asked. Really working, I mean, before last night. Yes, he said. I know exactly when. He didn't say anything more right away. And somehow Clara knew not to push. There was something in his expression. Not a secret, exactly. More like something held carefully, waiting for the right moment. I was about to make coffee, he said instead. At the cottage. If you want to come. She looked at him. She looked at the lighthouse. She looked at the lake. I walked over here without my shoes. She realized suddenly. She looked down. She'd been so caught up in the sound of the hammering that she'd walked out barefoot onto the rocky shore without noticing. Owen looked down at her feet. He looked up at her face. And then he did something she wouldn't have predicted from the serious, quiet boy she half remembered from 6th grade. He smiled. It was a slow smile, wide and genuine and surprisingly warm. Changed his whole face. Come on, then, he said. I'll make the coffee. You find your shoes. The cottage was small and immaculately kept. One main room, a small kitchen off one end, a sleeping loft overhead reached by a wooden ladder, a wood stove in the corner surrounded by a neat arrangement of split wood. The bookshelves that lined one full wall were densely packed and not arranged by any system she could identify. Histories next to paperback thrillers, next to field guides, next to poetry collections. The effect was not chaotic, exactly. More like evidence of a life spent reading whatever presented itself. On the small table by the window that faced the lake, there was a half-completed model lighthouse, the kind made of painted wood and tiny carved stones, meticulous in its detail. The lamp room at the top had a tiny working bulb in it. Clara picked it up carefully and looked at it. Did you make this? Working on it. I make models. It helps me think through the structural problems on the real building. It's beautiful. The detail was extraordinary. Tiny rivets in the iron railing, the suggestion of weathering in the painted stones, a minuscule door with a working hinge. She set it down carefully and looked around the room. On the wall above the wood stove there were several framed photographs. Most of them were landscapes, the lake in different seasons, the lighthouse in better days, white and clean against a summer sky. The old birch wood to the north of town in winter, all silver and stark. But one of the photographs stopped her. It was a family photograph, clearly old, slightly faded, in a simple wood frame. 2 adults and 3 children in front of a house she recognized as her own, the Ashford family home. The woman in the photograph was her mother, young, maybe 30, laughing at something outside the frame. The man beside her had his arm around her shoulders and was looking not at the camera but at her, with an expression of such clear and uncomplicated love that it was almost hard to look at directly. And the 3 children, she was one of them. The smallest one, maybe 4 or 5, sitting on the porch step with both hands full of what appeared to be rocks. Her sister Diane was beside her, older, already a little serious-faced. And between them, Clara said, "Is that you?" Owen came in from the kitchen with 2 mugs. "Yes," Owen said. "Our families were close." Owen handed her one of the mugs. The coffee was very good, dark and strong and real. He handed her one of the mugs. The coffee was very good, dark and strong and real. When I was young, your parents they were important to my family. My mother died when I was 6. Your parents were very kind to us. Your father especially. Clara looked at the photograph for another long moment. Her father's face. It was strange to see it in someone else's house, in a frame she'd never known existed, capturing a moment she didn't remember. Her father belonging to a story she hadn't been told. He was kind to a lot of people, she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. Owen agreed. He sat down in the chair by the wood stove, wrapping both hands around his mug. Come sit down. I'll tell you about the lighthouse. Clara sat across from him in the other chair, one leg pulled up beneath her the way she had always sat without quite meaning to, and listened. Owen talked the way he did everything else, apparently, deliberately, unhurriedly, with no wasted words. He told her things she hadn't known. He told her that her father hadn't just been the lighthouse keeper in a casual or traditional sense. He had been genuinely passionate about it. Not the mechanics of it, the wiring, the rotating lens, the signal schedules, although he'd understood all of that too. He'd been passionate about what it meant, the idea of a light in the dark, the responsibility of being the one who tended it. He used to say that a lighthouse doesn't shine for ships that can already see the shore. It shines for the ones who are lost. And you have to keep it burning even when there's no one in sight, because you never know when someone's going to need it. I remember him saying things like that. I didn't always understand what he meant. I'm not sure he was always talking about the lighthouse. He looked at the window. He told her the rest of it in pieces, pausing now and then to let things settle. After her father died in the winter of 1994, a stroke sudden, he'd been 47, the lighthouse had gone dark. The town had formally decommissioned it. There was no longer any practical need for an inland lighthouse. The lake was small, the boats were local, everyone knew the shore. The decision had been largely administrative, but her mother had found it very hard. The lighthouse going dark at the same time as Thomas was a synchronism she'd never quite gotten past. She talked about restoring it. Every few years she'd look into it, get the cost estimate, put it away again. It was always too much, and she was managing the house alone, and there were other things. But she never stopped thinking about it. She never told me. No, I think she found it hard to talk to you about your father. She found it hard to talk to me about a lot of things. That happens between people who love each other very much. Sometimes the size of the love makes the words harder, not easier. 3 years ago, at the hospital in Burlington, her mother had been very tired and Clara had held her hand and they talked about entirely safe things. The weather, the birds at the feeder outside the window, the nurse who was particularly kind. And under all of it, the enormous, unsayable things had moved like water under ice. Clara had driven back to Boston afterward and sat in her car in the parking garage for 45 minutes before she could move. What happened last night? She asked. I've been doing electrical assessment work out there. Owen was quiet for a longer moment this time. I found some of the original wiring. It's old, from the 30s when the system was updated. Cloth-wrapped copper. Most of it has deteriorated. But there's one circuit in the lamp room that's somehow still intact. I don't know how. By rights, it should be corroded through. But the wire is clean. And the lamp mechanism, which I told you was rusted solid. Yesterday afternoon, I was up there working, and I put some penetrating oil on the rotation gears, just to see. And before I left, I tried the mechanism. It didn't move. But last night, it moved. They were both quiet. The wood stove ticked. Outside, the lake lapped softly against the rocky shore. I'm not a superstitious person, Owen said. He said it plainly, without defensiveness. I've spent my life working with my hands. I trust what I can verify, but I have been unable to find a rational explanation for why that mechanism rotated and why that lamp illuminated at 12 minutes past midnight on the night that you came back. Clara didn't say anything. Your father, Owen said, lit the lighthouse every single night and extinguished it every morning for 17 years. 12 minutes past midnight was the time he always turned it on. said that was the deepest part of the night. The part when people most needed a light. The silence in the cottage was very complete. Clara set down her coffee mug because her hand had started to tremble very slightly and she didn't want to spill it. She looked out the window at the lake. The morning sun was full on the water now, turning it to beaten gold. "Tell me more about him," Owen Marsh did. They talked for 3 hours. The coffee was drunk and then another pot made and drunk too. At some point Owen found a box of crackers and a wheel of sharp cheddar and put them on the table between them, and they ate without really noticing they were eating, the way you do when you're so engaged in what's being said that the body has to fend for itself. Owen told her about her father with the specificity of someone who had known him well and observed him carefully and tucked the memories away. Not sentimentally. Owen didn't seem like a sentimental man exactly, but with the kind of care you give to things that matter. He told her about the summer her father had spent restoring the old dock, working every evening after his day job at the county surveyor's office, pulling out the rotted boards and replacing them one by one until the whole dock was new and sound again. Her father had sung while he worked. Not always on key, he didn't seem to notice or care. He told her about the winter he had organized a firewood drive for 3 families in the county who couldn't afford heating. He'd done it quietly, without making a thing of it, just put the word out to people he knew and arranged for the wood to arrive on the porches of those families before they knew to expect it. He'd run the reading group every other Thursday evening. Not a formal thing, just a group of men who wanted to read something worth reading and talk about it afterward over the very bad coffee Walt Reedy made. He was the only one who didn't treat me like a kid. He argued with me about books the same way he argued with the other men. He expected you to hold your own. Clara listened to all of this and felt something happening inside her that was not quite grief and not quite happiness. Something in between. Something that was both at once, the way the lake could be both dark and golden depending on where the light hit. The way her father had read to her every night. Not children's books, but actual books, edited for length and simplified here and there on the fly, but real books. Things he was reading himself, so that she'd grown up with a patchwork of adventures and ideas and characters that she hadn't understood fully but had absorbed like warm weather. The way he'd kept a small notebook in his shirt pocket and jotted things down constantly. Observations, things he wanted to remember, things that seemed important. Your mother kept them. Clara looked at him. You can look. She went back to the house alone after lunch. Owen had a delivery of materials arriving, something to do with the restoration project, and moved through the quiet rooms with the windows open, letting the lake air in. The study was at the back of the house, a small room she'd barely been allowed into as a child because it was where her father worked and where her mother later worked, keeping the household accounts and writing the long handwritten letters she sent to everyone who mattered to her. The desk was a heavy old oak thing that had come from her grandfather's house. The shelves on the walls held a mixture of reference books, framed family photographs, and the kind of accumulated miscellany that a family accumulates over generations without quite deciding to. A small carving of a loon, a glass paperweight containing a trapped air bubble, a child's drawing in a cheap frame that Clara recognized, with a start, as one of her own. She'd drawn it when she was 7 or 8. A house beside a lake with a lighthouse at the end of a narrow point, and in the lighthouse window, a stick figure with a circle of light around it. In her 7-year-old's handwriting across the bottom, "My dad the lightkeeper." She stood looking at it for a long time. Then she found the box. It was on the bottom shelf behind a row of encyclopedia volumes. A plain cardboard box, the kind you get from the liquor store when you're moving, with Thomas written on the side in her mother's handwriting. She carried it to the desk and sat down and opened it. The notebooks were exactly as she'd imagined them. Small, red-covered Moleskine-style notebooks, dozens of them, each one dated on the inside front cover in her father's particular handwriting. Precise but slightly cramped, as if he was always racing his own thoughts. They were arranged in order. The earliest one she could find was from 1976, the year before she was born. The most recent one was dated November 1993. Outside the window, a pair of swallows were doing something elaborate over the lake, swooping and crossing and never colliding, moving with the casual precision of things that trust the air completely. She picked up the most recent one and held it for a moment without opening it. She opened the notebook. Her father's handwriting looked back at her, small and immediate, as if he had just set down the pen. The first entry, November 2nd, Turned the light on at 12:12 as usual. Clear night. Colder now. Can feel the lake thinking about freezing along the edges. Clara called from school. She sounds good. Working hard. Proud of her. Should tell her that more often. She sat with that for quite a while. She turned the pages slowly. It was like reading a man's interior weather. He wrote about the lighthouse, conditions, observations, things he noticed about the lake and the water and the birds. He wrote about books he was reading and ideas they gave him. He wrote about his wife, her mother, Margaret, with a particular kind of affectionate exasperation that was so recognizable and so tender that it hurt to read. She found an entry from November 15th. Can't sleep tonight. Went up to the lamp room and sat with the light for a while. There's something about this time of year, the lake goes very quiet, and if you sit in the lamp room with the light going and look out at the water, it feels like being at the center of something. Like the whole dark world is arranged around this one small brightness. I don't think I'll ever stop needing this place. Some people have cathedrals. I have a lighthouse on a lake in Vermont, and that's enough. That's everything, actually. The last entry in the notebook was dated November 28th. Thanksgiving, 1993. 6 weeks before he died. Good day. Full house, Clara and Diane both home, and Owen and his father, and the Kellerman family from down the road. Margaret cooked for 3 days and then pretended she hadn't when everyone said how wonderful it all was. She does that, makes the effort invisible so the effect seems effortless. I know how much it costs her. The lake today was the most extraordinary color, almost violet in the late afternoon. I pointed it out to Clara before dinner and she came to the window and we watched it for a while. She said, "Dad, do you ever get tired of looking at it?" And I said, "No, Bug. Do you?" And then she thought about it a minute, which is what she always does, actually considers before she answers, and then she said, "No, I don't think I could." That's something. That's really something. Clara closed the notebook. She was crying. She noticed this without alarm, the way you notice weather. Just tears, moving slowly down her face in the quiet study with the swallows outside the window and the lake beyond them. She sat in her father's chair and cried for a while, which was something she hadn't let herself do properly in a very long time. Then she wiped her face with the back of her hand, put the notebook carefully back in the box, and went to make herself a cup of that terrible old chamomile tea. She drove into Millhaven the next morning to get groceries and coffee and whatever else she needed to make the house feel livable for however long she was going to be there. She hadn't decided how long. She'd left a vague message for her editor about needing a few weeks. She'd sent her sister a text. "I'm at the house. I'm okay. I'll explain later." Diane had responded with a string of question marks and then, after a pause, a single word, "Good." The bones of it were the same. The white church steeple, the old hardware store, the brick building at the corner of Main and Elm that had been a bank, then a pharmacy, then apparently was now a cafe. A handwritten sign in the window said Millhaven Roasters, open 6 a.m., and the smell coming through the prop door was extraordinary. She went in. The cafe had clearly been converted from the old bank space with affection and some ingenuity. The original tin ceiling was still there, painted a deep forest green. The old bank counter had been repurposed into the coffee bar. The wrought iron teller windows now used as shelving for bags of coffee and ceramic mugs and a collection of local artwork. The seating was a cheerful mix of salvaged church pews and mismatched wooden chairs, and one inexplicable velvet sofa in the corner that appeared to have been there since someone's grandmother's living room was being emptied. Behind the coffee bar was a young woman in her mid-20s with a red braid down her back and flower on her apron, and the specific energy of someone who has already been awake for a long time and considers this a lifestyle choice rather than a burden. She looked up when Clara came in. "Morning," she said. "What can I get you?" "The largest coffee you make," Clara said. "And whatever that smell is, cardamom rolls," the young woman said with evident pride. "Just out of the oven. 5 minutes ago. 2 of those, please." The young woman, her name tag said Penny, began pulling the espresso. Clara found a stool at the old bank counter and sat down. She was aware of glances, the way you're aware of them in a small town where you're almost but not quite a stranger. She kept her eyes on the coffee bar. "You're Clara Ashford," Penny said. setting down the espresso with practiced efficiency. "You're staying at the Lighthouse house. Owen mentioned you might be coming. He's been hoping you'd come back for a while now. Has he?" The coffee was deeply, immediately good, rich and dark and not bitter at all, the kind of coffee that makes you understand why people care about coffee. The young woman, her name tag said Penny, leaned on the counter with comfortable familiarity. She shrugged. "I think he wanted to be ready when you got here." Clara considered this. "You know him well?" "He's my uncle, my dad's older brother." She began wiping down the counter with a cloth. Clara ate her cardamom roll slowly. It was everything it had smelled like, warm and spiced and flaky, with a sweetness that wasn't overdone. She was aware of the cafe around her, the low hum of conversation, the sounds of a small-town morning, a delivery truck out on the street, someone laughing in the back booth, the woodpecker from somewhere outside that might have been the same one from her yard this morning. "Do you know about the light from the lighthouse 2 nights ago?" Penny's eyes widened slightly. She glanced quickly around the cafe and then back at Clara. The fire chief filed a report that said, "Cause undetermined. People are talking about it." "What are they saying?" Diplomatically, Penny sighed. Old Walt Reedy at the bookshop said it was Thomas Ashford. Said that man had told him once that if there was anything left of him after he was gone, it would be at that lighthouse. Old Walt is 78 and he was your father's close friend, and he cried a little when he told me, so make of that what you will. And my Uncle Owen didn't tell anyone what he thought. But when I asked him, he said he thought the lighthouse lit up because it was ready to be seen. What does that mean? I don't know. Like I said, he doesn't say things directly. She went to the bookshop. She was standing outside with her coffee and her grocery bags, thinking vaguely about heading back to the house, when her feet turned the other way on their own and took her down the half-block to Reedy's Books and Maps, which sat between a post office and a place that seemed to sell handmade candles, and whose window display had not changed in any fundamental way since she was old enough to remember it. Maps on the walls, books in teetering piles, a small hand-lettered sign that read Browsers. Welcome. Browsers staying all day also welcome. Please be comfortable. The bell above the door announced her. The shop was warm and slightly dim, with the particular quality of light that only exists in old bookshops, filtered through bookshelves and book spines, enriched by years of paper and print, soft and amber and absolutely specific. She waited. After a moment, a figure emerged from between 2 towering shelves, old Walt Reedy, who was indeed 78 and showed it and didn't seem to mind. He came forward and took both her hands in his, which were small and dry and warm. He squeezed them once and then looked at her face for another moment, with a frankness that would have felt rude from anyone else. "You look like him around the eyes. Everyone says I look like my mother. Around the eyes. Come and sit down. You saw the light?" "Yes." He nodded. He poured the tea with the steadiness of long habit. "Well, some things don't know how to stop being what they were made to be. People are saying it was him, that my father did it somehow. I'm not saying it was him. I'm saying it was love, which may amount to the same thing depending on your theology. You were always like this. I remember you being exactly like this, talking in circles that somehow end up being perfectly clear. I am a bookseller. I sell ideas. I don't sell certainties. Certainties are available at the hardware store. He missed you, not harshly, not as an accusation, just as a thing that was true and could be said now. I know, you were his favorite, not that he'd have ever said so out loud, and not that he loved Diane any less. Not that he loved Diane any less, but you would sit in that lamp room for hours as a little girl and watch the light go around and ask him questions about the dark. I had to leave. Couldn't be here. The house, the lake, the lighthouse, all of it. It was too much of him and too much of the absence of him at the same time. I thought if I stayed I'd just... The lighthouse was very quiet. Walt was quiet for a moment. Not that you'd leave, Walt said. He understood that. He was afraid that you'd build your life so far from the center of yourself that you'd forget how to find your way back. He wrote that too. He understood that too. You found the notebooks. Last night, Margaret told me about them. She kept every one. He wrote in them about you very often. I know. The bookshop was very quiet around them. The maps on the walls held their careful lines. He wrote that too. He wanted to understand you, I suppose. She looked up. I want to understand what happened to the lighthouse. And I want to stay long enough to do that. Walt smiled. You're going to need the town records. The town clerk was a woman named Agnes, who was perhaps 60 and had the comprehensive and slightly predatory organizational intelligence of someone who has been custodian of other people's paperwork for decades and takes the responsibility seriously. She found the lighthouse records within 4 minutes. Clara spent the afternoon at the long table in the records room, going through the records. The history of the Ashford Lighthouse, official name, Mirror Lake Light Station, though no one had ever called it that, was more substantial than she'd expected. It had been a working navigational aid from 1891 to 1994, 103 years of continuous operation, through 2 world wars and the Depression and the various upheavals of the century, maintained by 3 generations of the Ashford family. Her great-grandfather Franklin Ashford had built it with a combination of his own savings and a county grant in 1891. He'd been a surveyor, like her father, and had been deeply unhappy about 2 drowning incidents on the lake in the 1880s. Fishermen out late, caught by weather, unable to see the rocky points in the dark. He designed the lighthouse himself, with some technical consultation from the state, and built it over 2 summers with the help of his sons and several willing neighbors. It had worked. In the 103 years of its operation, there had been no documented drownings on the lake. Her grandfather's hand was compact and angular. He'd been meticulous. Every night logged. Time of illumination, weather conditions, visibility on the water, any activity noted on the lake. The entries were brief, functional. They were not the private reflections of the notebooks, just the operational record. But occasionally something slipped through. A note in the margin. Remarkable fog tonight. The light seemed to float in it. Or a brief addition at the end of an entry. See. Helped me turn the lens tonight. First time. She found the last entry in her father's hand. January 3rd, 1994. Clear and very cold. Stars excellent. Lit at 12:12. Extinguished at dawn. Lake quiet. Good night. He died on January 11th, 1994. 8 days later. She sat there in the records room with the January 3rd page and thought about that night. He'd been up in the lamp room at midnight, alone in the cold, watching the lake, doing his ordinary job with his ordinary care. 8 days from the end of his life, with no way of knowing. And the lake had been quiet, and it had been a good night. She thought that was something. She let it be something. She spent another hour going through the records, looking for anything related to the lamp mechanism, the electrical system, the specific components that Owen had identified as inexplicably functional. She found technical specifications from the 1930s renovation and a report from 1992 that noted some deterioration in the wiring but assessed the system as serviceable with basic maintenance. She found a final inspection report from February 1994, after her father's death, that assessed the system as decommissioned and safe to leave non-operational. She photographed everything relevant with her phone. Then she found something at the back of the 1993 logbook that made her go very still. It was a letter, handwritten, folded and tucked between the back cover and the last page. Addressed to no one, or perhaps to everyone. There was no name at the top. Just a date, December 30th, 1993, 12 days before he died. This light has been in my family for over a century. My great-grandfather built it because he believed that keeping a light in the dark was one of the most human things a person could do. The woman sat in the records room, with a mix of sadness and understanding. The woman's eyes moved to the first log entry in the 1800s. Not because the dark is bad, just because there are people in it and they need to see. I've kept this light for 17 years and I have never once regretted it. Not the cold mornings. Not the nights when the equipment needed attention. Because I have climbed up into that lamp room on nights when the lake was frozen solid and the stars were thick overhead and turned on that light and watched it sweep across the water, and I have felt, profoundly, unmistakably, that this was what I was for. This small, specific light. This particular darkness. This lake I know so well I can read its moods the way I read my children's faces. She can make light with words the way I make it with a lamp, and that's a different kind of keeping, but it's the same impulse. The lighthouse will outlast me. Stone outlasts almost everything. And the light, whoever keeps it, whatever form it takes. I believe the light will outlast me too. That's enough. That's more than enough. Clara sat in the records room of the Millhaven Municipal Building for a very long time after reading that. Agnes knocked on the door at 5 o'clock to say she was closing up. Clara thanked her and gathered her things. She drove back to the lake house in the golden late afternoon light. She sat on the porch and watched the light change over the water. She didn't cry this time. She felt, instead, something that she would later struggle to describe accurately, a kind of arriving. The lake turned gold, and then rose, and then the deep violet her father had noted in his last autumn. And then the first stars came out over the tree line to the east. And Clara Ashford sat on her porch and watched it all and felt, for the first time in many years, entirely located. The next morning, she began to write. She hadn't planned to. She'd brought her laptop out of habit, the way she carried it everywhere, her tool, her livelihood, her way of processing the world. But she'd opened it on the kitchen table largely just to look at the messages she'd been ignoring, to begin the process of re-engaging with her life in Boston, whatever that was going to look like from here. Instead, she'd started writing. Owen knocked on the kitchen door at noon, which she'd learned in the 3 days since her arrival was something he did. Knocked at the kitchen door rather than the front, the way you do when you're not a visitor but something more familiar. He came in, looked at what she was doing, and without comment put the kettle on and made sandwiches from the groceries he'd picked up in town because she'd mentioned needing to go and clearly hadn't. "Thank you," she said when he set a plate beside the laptop. "It's bread and cheese," he said. "Don't thank me for bread and cheese." She looked up at him. He'd been out at the lighthouse since early that morning. She'd heard his truck go past at 7, and he had the look of someone who had accomplished something significant and was quietly pleased about it. His flannel was different today, a dark blue, and there was a smear of something that might have been axle grease on his left forearm. "How's it going out there?" she said. "Good." He sat down across the table with his own sandwich. "I've been able to clear the access to the lamp room properly. The stairs are safe. I had them inspected last week and the stone is sound. I've also found something interesting in the lamp room." "What kind of interesting?" she said. "Come and see this afternoon." "Okay." She wrote for another hour. She ate the sandwich. She drank the tea Owen had made. He made tea the way he did everything, with unhurried attention. It was always exactly right. They didn't talk much while she was working, which she noticed was something he was comfortable with. Silence, she was learning, was not an absence of communication for Owen Marsh. It was just another form of it. When she finally closed the laptop and stretched and looked at him, he was reading a book from the shelf in the sitting room. She could see the spine from where she sat. A field guide to the birds of Vermont and New Hampshire. He was reading it the way most people don't read field guides, which was as if it contained stories. "I didn't know you were still a reader. The eraser, the eraser. You always had a book when you weren't supposed to." He looked up then. A corner of his mouth moved. She was a perfectly fine teacher for people who didn't already know what she was teaching. He closed the book and stood up. "Ready?" She'd been inside the lighthouse before as a child many times, but she was unprepared for what it felt like now. Stepping through the old iron door, which Owen had cleared and rehung so that it opened smoothly, and finding herself inside the stone tower. It was cool inside, and quiet in a particular way. Not the quiet of an empty building, but the quiet of a thick stone structure, which absorbs sound and holds it, so that the sounds inside become very intimate and the sounds outside are very remote. Owen had rigged a temporary lighting system, a string of LED work lights along the inner wall that provided enough illumination to climb safely. Clara went up ahead of him, one hand on the cold iron railing. The staircase wound upward in a tight spiral. Iron steps set into the stone, original to the building, the edges worn smooth by a century of feet. There were 37 steps. She counted without meaning to. And then the lamp room. It was a circular room at the top of the tower, perhaps 12 feet across, ringed with thick glass panes that looked out in all directions. The glass was old and slightly wavy, the kind that had been there since before flat glass existed, and looking through it made the world outside seem like something seen through water. Still recognizable, but softer, less insistent on its own literalness. At the center of the room stood the lamp mechanism. The original Fresnel lens, or rather what was left of it. A hexagonal column of glass prisms in a bronze frame, mounted on a cast-iron rotation table. It was extraordinary even in its deteriorated state. The glass prisms caught what light there was and scattered it into small, shifting rainbows across the stone walls. Clara walked slowly around it. "It's more beautiful than I remembered," she said. "Most things are," Owen said, which was an unusually lyrical thing for him to say and suggested he was in a particular mood. "But look at this." He moved to the base of the mechanism and crouched down. She crouched beside him. He pointed to the rotation table, where the gears and the drive mechanism were housed. He said, "When I applied the penetrating oil last week, I assumed the gears had seized permanently from the rust. That's the typical result of 30 years without maintenance on cast iron. But look." She looked where he was pointing. The gears were clean, not just slightly freed up, clean. The surface of the cast iron was dark and slightly oiled but not corroded. The teeth of the gears were precise and unrusted. "Someone maintained this," she said. "Recently," Owen said, "someone has been up here and applied oil to this mechanism." He held up a small square of cloth, old flannel, dark with oil. Clara looked at the cloth. It was a piece of dark green flannel. She stood up slowly. She looked around the room. Outside the wavy glass, the lake stretched away in every direction, enormous and blue and utterly still in the afternoon light. "Owen," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "My mother was ill for 3 years before she died." She said this carefully, working through it as she spoke. "She couldn't have come up here. She couldn't have. And the property management company wouldn't have had any reason to access the lamp room." "No. And you started your assessment work 3 weeks ago." "Yes." "So who—" She stopped. He looked at her. His light gray-blue eyes were steady. "I don't know," he said. "I truly don't. I've thought about it from every practical angle I can find." She looked at the gears. She looked at the cloth. She looked at the lens, which was catching the afternoon sun and scattering light across the walls in slow, shifting patterns. She said, "If I can. Do you believe in things you can't explain?" Owen was quiet for a moment. He turned the cloth over in his hands. "I believe." He looked at the lamp mechanism. "I don't know if that answers your question. It might." That evening, Penny came out from town with food, a proper dinner inexplicably in containers, roasted chicken and root vegetables and fresh bread and what appeared to be an entire pie, apple, the kind with a lattice top. "I had leftover stock from the cafe, and I wanted to see the house. Owen's told me about it forever. I've never described this house to you. You've mentioned it." She looked past Clara into the kitchen. "Oh, it's lovely. Can I come in?" They ate around the kitchen table with the windows open and the lake visible in the dusk light. Penny talked with the easy fluency of someone to whom conversation comes naturally. About the cafe, about the town, about the various characters of Millhaven who had either not changed at all or had changed so completely they were unrecognizable to themselves. She talked about the Lighthouse restoration project with genuine enthusiasm, asking Owen questions that suggested she'd been listening carefully to his reports of progress. Clara found herself talking too, which was not something she'd expected. About Boston, about the writing, about the places she'd been, and Penny was an excellent audience for travel stories, leaning forward with her elbows on the table and her red braid over one shoulder, asking follow-up questions that were better than the average interviewers. Owen ate his dinner and listened and occasionally said something precise and dry that made both women laugh and seemed to genuinely surprise him when it did. After dinner, they took their wine out to the porch. The night had come fully on. No moon yet, just stars, more of them than Clara ever saw in Boston. The lake was a dark mirror below the stars, and the soft sounds of the water and the tree frogs and the occasional loon came out of the darkness with great clarity. "I want to ask you something. I hope it's okay." "Ask, why did you come back? I mean, really come back? Now, after all this time?" "I don't fully know. I think I'd been running out of the particular kind of fuel I was using." The kind that's made from forward motion. From new places and new work and not standing still long enough to feel the things that catch up to you when you stand still. And then my mother's estate was settled, and the house became mine, and something in me just pointed north, like a compass, without asking permission. A compass points toward what's true, or magnetic north. Your mother knew you'd come back. She used to come in to the cafe on Saturday mornings, the last years when she could still drive herself. She'd sit at the counter and have her tea. And sometimes, out of nowhere, she'd say something like, "Clara will be here before long, I think." She didn't say it sadly. More like she was just noting something she was confident about. She knew me better than I knew myself. Mothers often do. Mine certainly does, and she's maddening about it. They sat on the porch until late, not talking constantly. The conversation moved in and out the way it does among people who are becoming comfortable with each other, leaving room for the night sounds in the lake and their own separate thoughts. At some point Owen said, quietly, "Clara, look." She looked where he was looking. Far across the lake, barely visible against the dark shore, a few small lights were moving on the water. Lanterns, she realized. Someone was out in a boat, maybe two boats. The lanterns moved slowly, describing small, amber arcs. Who is that? Probably the Kellerman kids. They do that on warm nights this time of year. Float around with lanterns. Their grandfather started it. Before your father's tradition. Tom Kellerman and your father used to take turns keeping the tradition alive. The lanterns on the water, the light in the lighthouse. They called it keeping the lake warm. The idea was that a place only stays warm if people tend it. Like a fire, you can't just assume it. You have to keep putting wood on. The lighthouse, dark at this hour, just a silhouette. "I want to help with the restoration," she said, not impulsively, carefully. "I want to be part of bringing it back." Owen looked at her. "There's one condition." "Which is?" "When it's running again, I want to be the one to turn it on. The first time." Owen was quiet for a moment. 12 minutes past midnight? 12 minutes past midnight. What followed was one of the most sustained and satisfying periods of Clara's adult life. Though she wouldn't have predicted any of it, she stayed. She called her sister Diane, who came out for a weekend in early July, and walked through the house and cried in the study, and ate Penny's cardamom rolls and spent an afternoon with Owen learning more about the restoration project than Clara had told her. Before she left, Diane stood on the porch with her coffee and looked at the lighthouse and then at Clara and said, "I never understood why you loved it here so much. I always wanted to leave." She paused. "I think I understand it better now." She went back to her life in Philadelphia, but she called more, and she sent money for the restoration project. The work on the lighthouse was methodical and Owen was its heart. He understood old structures the way her father had understood the lake, with an intimacy that came from years of careful attention. He worked from dawn most days, and Clara fell into the habit of bringing coffee out to him at the lighthouse at 8 in the morning, and sometimes staying to work alongside him. She wasn't skilled with tools, but she was capable and attentive and willing to learn, and Owen was a patient teacher who explained things without condescension. She learned to identify the original timber components and distinguish them from later replacements. She learned how to apply the right kind of consolidant to deteriorating stone. She learned, slowly and with much effort, to appreciate the difference between work done quickly and work done well, which she found she'd known in theory for years but only now understood in her hands. There were other workers, too. A structural engineer from Burlington came several times to assess the stairs and confirm their integrity. A heritage electrician came up from Montpelier to consult on the wiring and determine what could be safely restored and what needed replacement. 2 young men from town, brothers, friends of Penny's, came most Saturdays to do the heavy work that needed more than 2 sets of hands. Gradually, the lighthouse changed. The lower windows were unboarded and cleaned. The iron door was properly rehung and treated against further rust. The lamp room windows were cleaned inside and out, and the wavy old glass, which the heritage consultant told them was irreplaceable and should be preserved at all costs, was removed carefully, 1 pane at a time, cleaned and reseated in rebuilt frames. The Fresnel lens was cleaned and its brass components polished. This took 3 full days, working carefully with appropriate solvents and small brushes, and the result was breathtaking. The lens emerged from its decades of tarnish into its actual self, which was a masterwork of Victorian optical engineering. The glass prisms clear and faceted and perfect, the brass bright as new. The electrical system was rebuilt on the original circuit plan, with modern safety standards incorporated by the heritage electrician, who was a methodical woman named Suzanne who admired the original cloth-wrapped copper that still functioned and saved a section of it in a careful preservation envelope as part of the historical record. Clara wrote through all of it. Not the travel piece. Something else. The thing she'd started the morning after reading her father's letter in the records room. It was a book, she realized, though it had taken her several weeks to be willing to call it that. It was the story of a lighthouse and the family that tended it and what the light meant to them and what it cost them and what it gave. She wrote in the mornings at the kitchen table. She worked on the lighthouse in the afternoons. In the evenings, she sat on the porch or walked the lake road or sat in the caretaker's cottage while Owen worked on the model lighthouse, which was now nearly complete, and they talked or didn't talk in the comfortable rhythm they'd established over the weeks. She noticed things about Owen Marsh. She noticed that he was the kind of person who did what he said and said what he meant and didn't apologize for either. She noticed that he had a very particular relationship with quiet. He didn't fill it or fear it but moved within it like a man who had made peace with his own company long ago and found it sufficient, which in her experience was rare and slightly remarkable. She noticed that he was funny, in a way that required you to be paying attention. His humor was dry and quiet and arrived at unexpected moments and then was gone before you were sure it had been there. She noticed that he asked her about her work with genuine curiosity and listened to the answers with genuine attention, which was different from the social listening she'd grown accustomed to in Boston. She noticed that when he handed her coffee, he always handed it with the handle turned toward her. She didn't examine any of these things too directly. She just let them accumulate the way details accumulate in a story you're telling, one by one, until there's suddenly a whole thing you hadn't quite seen coming. She was learning, this summer, the value of being exactly where she was. The first night of summer, the summer solstice, late June, was when Millhaven floated its lanterns. Clara hadn't expected to be there for it. She hadn't thought she'd still be in Millhaven by late June. But she was still there, and she'd been told about the festival, and she'd been invited by approximately everyone she'd met, so she went. The whole town came to the shore. People she hadn't seen in years came up to her with the easy warmth of small towns where the memory for faces is long and the grudges are generally short. There were children she didn't know, who were the children of people she'd known, running through the crowd with their lanterns held in both hands, completely absorbed in the task of keeping the small flames alive against the evening breeze. There were couples young and old sitting on blankets on the bank. Walt Reedy was there, in his cardigan, with a lantern he'd clearly made himself. It was slightly lopsided and entirely charming. Penny was there, with a group of friends, all of them in some state of joy, lanterns of varying sizes and shapes, and already at least one of them on fire by accident. And Owen was there, standing at the edge of the crowd near the water, watching it all with his characteristic combination of separation and engagement. Present but not quite performing presence, the way he always was. He had 2 lanterns. He handed one to Clara. It was a proper one. She could tell he'd made it himself, wire frame and wax paper, with a small tea candle inside, the flame protected from the breeze by the paper walls. "When do we launch them?" she asked. "When you're ready." She looked at the lantern for a moment. She thought about standing in this water at 7 years old, with her father's hand on her shoulder, watching a lantern go. "I've been thinking about something. All right, I've been thinking about what my father said. About the lighthouse. About lighting it for the people who can't see the shore. I don't think he was just talking about the lighthouse." Owen looked at her. "I think he was talking about all of it. The notebooks, the reading group, the firewood, all of it. He was just always just doing what he could to keep the dark a little less dark for the people around him." She paused. "What?" Owen said. She held the lantern carefully. The water was dark around the rocks. The first lanterns from the far side of the crowd were already on the water, moving slowly, orange and gold. "Care is a risk. I know that. I've kept my distance from it too, for a long time, but I think the risk of not caring is worse. I think you end up hollow. traveling through a world of beautiful things you can't quite let yourself touch. She looked at him. Did you know I was coming back? Really? Before I got here? He was quiet for a moment. Then, I hoped, he said. I always thought you left something here. The most essential part of yourself, I think. People can go a long time without the most essential part of themselves. But eventually, the lighthouse lit up. She stood with that for a moment. She waded out into the shallow water. It was cold. It was always cold, even in June. This was Vermont, and this was a mountain-fed lake. And she bent down carefully and let the lantern go. It caught the surface and steadied. The small flame inside it burned steady and clear. It began to move, caught by the barely there current near the shore, moving outward and eastward across the water. Owen waded out beside her and launched his own lantern. They stood in the cold water and watched their lanterns go. Around them, dozens of others were entering the water, wading and laughing. The night filling with the warm glow of hundreds of small lights moving across the dark surface of the lake. It was, Clara thought, the most beautiful thing she'd seen in 40 years of looking at beautiful things in 40 countries. She thought, there she goes, Bug, right up to the stars. She said it out loud, quietly, not really meaning Owen to hear. But he did hear because he was standing very close. He reached out and took her hand, in the cold water, in the lantern light, and held it without saying anything at all. She held his hand back. Around them, the lake burned warm. The town wanted to make a thing of it. Frank, the mayor, proposed a ceremony. Penny proposed a party. Walt Reedy proposed that someone write something appropriate to read aloud. Penny proposed a party. Walt Reedy proposed that someone write something appropriate to read aloud. The Heritage Board from Burlington wanted to send a representative. The local newspaper, still a paper newspaper printed weekly, one of the last in Vermont, wanted to do a feature. Clara said yes to all of it. But she had one requirement, which she'd stated in June and which everyone understood. At 12 minutes past midnight, on the night of the lighthouse's restoration, she would be the one to turn on the light. The ceremony in the afternoon was lovely. Frank gave a speech that was slightly too long and extremely heartfelt. Frank gave a speech that was slightly too long and extremely heartfelt. Dr. Horton, the Heritage Board representative, spoke about the historical significance of the Mirror Lake Light Station and the Ashford family's contribution to Vermont's inland maritime heritage. Walt Reedy read something, of his own composition, as it turned out, which nobody had expected but which was quietly extraordinary. A meditation on light and time and the persistence of love through stone. There were sandwiches. There was cake. Penny had made 6 cardamom rolls. People who had never met Clara came up and told her things about her father that she hadn't known. Each one another piece of a person she was rebuilding from fragments. A man in his 70s told her he'd helped him through his divorce by simply showing up at his house once a week for a year and drinking coffee with him and not making him talk about it. A woman Clara's age told her she'd learned to read because Thomas Ashford had come to her school one afternoon and read something aloud in a way that made her understand that words were not obstacles to get through but doors to go into. She received these stories like gifts. She wrote them down in a small notebook she'd bought at Reedy's, a red one, the same kind her father had used. As the afternoon wound down and the crowd dispersed, the lake turned its evening colors and the stars began their slow appearance, and the temperature dropped just enough to make it feel like the world was settling towards something important. Penny went back to town. Walt Reedy was driven home by a neighbor at 10, because his feet hurt and he was wise enough to know his limits. But he told Clara he'd be watching from his window. Dr. Horton had stayed, sitting now on the porch of the house with a glass of wine and the expression of a woman who has been in the presence of living history and intends to stay in the presence of it as long as possible. Diane had driven up from Philadelphia for the day. She was sitting beside Clara on the dock, their feet hanging over the water, talking in the easy shorthand of sisters who have been apart and are finding their way back. "Are you going to stay?" "I think so," Clara said. "For a while. Maybe longer than a while." She looked at the dark water. "I don't know. I'm less afraid of not knowing than I used to be." Diane squeezed her arm. They sat in comfortable quiet for a while. At 11:30, Clara went inside and changed into warmer clothes and put on her old canvas jacket and her good boots and came back out. Owen was waiting at the foot of the path to the lighthouse with a lantern, an actual lantern, an old kerosene one that had belonged to her grandfather, which she'd found in the cellar and he'd cleaned and rewicked. He said, "Ready?" "Yes." They walked the path to the lighthouse together in the dark. The lantern he carried swung gently, making their shadows move. The lake was very quiet. The stars were very bright. An owl spoke from somewhere in the trees above the path and then went silent again. At the lighthouse door, Clara put her hand on the iron for a moment. It was cool under her palm. "He would have loved tonight," she said. "He would have loved it very much," Owen agreed. She opened the door. They went up the stairs together, the lantern lighting the old stone as they climbed. 37 steps. Her hand on the railing, his light making the shadows move. At the lamp room door, she stopped. "I want to go in alone," she said. "Just for a minute." He nodded. He handed her the lantern. She pushed open the lamp room door and went in. The room was different now than it had been in the afternoon of her first visit. The windows, cleaned and reseated, were clear and dark with the night outside them. The Fresnel lens stood at the center of the room, polished to perfection, its prisms waiting. The new electrical panel on the wall was neat and modern and felt entirely right, somehow beside the Victorian machinery, not a betrayal of the original but a continuation. She walked to the lens and put her free hand on the brass frame. She stood there in the quiet. She thought about her father climbing these stairs every night for 17 years. She thought about his great-grandfather building this tower from stone and intention and the specific human refusal to let the dark be the last word. She thought about the letter in the logbook. "I believe the light will outlast me too." She thought about herself at 9 years old in the lamp room, turning the lens by hand while her father watched. She took a breath. She looked at the clock on the wall, the original clock restored and running, a slightly formal gesture that Owen had insisted on, because the lighthouse had always had a clock and always should. 12 minutes past midnight. She reached for the switch. The light came on. The Fresnel lens turned, slowly at first, then finding its speed, the motor making a deep, even hum that she felt as much as heard. The light built in the lens, concentrating through the prisms, and then the beam swept out through the clear windows of the lamp room and across the lake. She watched it go. One sweep, and then another, and then again. She stood in the turning light and let herself feel everything. Grief and love and the particular joy that lives right next to grief and cannot be separated from it. The weight of absence and the lightness of what remains. The 30 years of distance and the fact that she was here now, which was the only fact that could be changed. After a while, she became aware that Owen was in the doorway. He'd come up quietly. She hadn't heard him on the stairs. She looked at him. His face in the turning light, now lit, now in shadow, now lit again, was very still and very warm. "He would be so glad you're here." "I know." The light swept again. Outside, on the porch of the house, she would later learn, Dr. Horton from the Heritage Board had started crying and was somewhat embarrassed about it. On the dock, Diane had stood up from where she'd been sitting and put both hands over her heart. In his window on Main Street, Walt Reedy had watched the light sweep the lake and nodded once, slowly, at something he'd been waiting for. And in the caretaker's cottage, Penny told her this later, laughing. She'd been watching on her phone via the live stream the newspaper had set up, from Penny's apartment in town, and when the light had come on she'd apparently said, out loud, to no one in particular, "There we go." She stayed through August and September. The book grew under her hands, shaped itself from something tentative into something true and full and hers. She wrote about love and absence and homecoming and the particular courage it takes to stand still long enough to know where you are. She wrote about a lighthouse and a lake and a family and what it means to tend a light. She wrote it for herself, and she wrote it for her father, and she wrote it for the reader she didn't know yet who would find it on some future night and feel less alone in their own particular kind of lost. The lighthouse became what it had been designed to be. The town used it as a navigational landmark again. The Heritage Board installed an interpretive display in the base of the tower. School groups came to see it. On warm evenings, people kayaked out to the point and sat on the rocks and looked up at it. And every night, at 12 minutes past midnight, the light went on. Clara wasn't always the one to turn it on. Sometimes Owen did it. Sometimes Frank, the mayor, did it with great ceremony, as if performing a civic duty of the highest order. Once, Penny did it and posted a video of the moment that got a startling number of views online and briefly made Millhaven famous among the kind of people who keep lists of overlooked places to visit. But some nights, Clara climbed the 37 stairs herself. On the night of the autumn equinox, Owen climbed up with her. They stood in the lamp room together as the light went on and the beam swept across the water. The lake in September was different from the lake in summer. The greens of the far shore had begun their turn toward gold and russet, and the light at this angle caught them and made them glow. "I've been meaning to ask you something," Owen said. "Ask," she said. "The book," he said. "Is there a dedication?" "Yes," she said. "It says, 'For my father, who taught me that the point of a lighthouse is not the lighthouse.'" The lake in the background, the greens of the far shore had begun their turn toward gold and russet, and the light at this angle caught them and made them glow. And for everyone who has ever needed a light in the dark, and found one. That's good. I also added something. What? She looked at him. The light swept between them. And for Owen, who kept the light on while I was finding my way back. He looked at her for a long moment. His gray-blue eyes in the turning light were very clear. Then he said very quietly, "I'm glad you came back, Clara. I'm glad I came back too." They stood in the light together, looking out at the lake. And the water below them was dark and quiet and lit by the turning beam. And the stars overhead were many and certain. And somewhere out on the water, a loon called once. That long, trembling sound, the sound of something saying, "I am here. I am still here. I am here." October came to Millhaven, and with it the particular beauty of a Vermont autumn that people drive hours to see. The trees on the far shore became extraordinary. Every conceivable shade of gold and red and orange, reflected in the lake below them so perfectly that the water seemed to burn. The air turned sharp and clean in the mornings, carrying with it the smell of wood smoke from the chimneys along the lake road. The light had a different quality now, lower, more golden, the way afternoon light becomes when the earth tilts and the sun takes its time. Clara began making changes to the house. Nothing dramatic, nothing that erased what it had been. She refinished the floors very carefully so that the old grain showed through. She had the kitchen painted a color she called morning fog, and which her sister, when she saw photos, called gray, and which Clara thought her father would have approved of entirely. She brought in firewood for the winter and stacked it on the porch the way her father had always stacked it. She kept the notebooks on the desk in the study. She read them sometimes, a few pages on a quiet evening, allowing herself the company of her father's interior voice. She'd stopped being ambushed by them. They were part of the ordinary texture of the house now, part of what it felt like to live here. She called Diane every Sunday. She had her editor to the house for a weekend in late October, and the editor, a practical New Yorker who was not, by her own admission, susceptible to the charms of small-town Vermont, went back to New York with the expression of someone who had discovered something they hadn't known they were missing. She had dinner with Walt Reedy every other week at Reedy's in the back among the bookshelves with the terrible hot plate tea and the biscuits, talking about books and history and the kind of ideas that only get properly examined when two people have made enough time to examine them. She helped Owen with the ongoing maintenance of the lighthouse. There was always something. A hinge to lubricate, a window to recaulk before winter, a section of railing that needed attention. She didn't mind. She had come to understand, over these months, what it meant to tend something. The daily practice of it. The way care accumulates into a relationship with a place or a person or an idea that becomes part of the structure of your life. She closed the laptop and sat in the kitchen in the lamp light with the lake outside the window in the dark and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing completed. A thing made from love and grief and the long way around, but made. She picked up her jacket and went outside. The night was cold. The first real cold of the season, the kind that means business. The stars overhead were winter sharp, the kind that appear when the air is cold enough to hold no moisture, just clarity. She walked down the path to the lighthouse. The door was unlocked. She went in and climbed the stairs, not hurrying, one hand on the railing, counting without meaning to. 37 steps. In the lamp room, she stood at the window and looked out at the lake. The water below was black and perfectly still. The stars reflected in it. The whole dark surface was stars, and it was impossible for a moment to tell where the sky ended and the lake began. And Clara thought, my father was right. Some things don't know how to stop being what they were made to be. The clock on the wall said 12 minutes past midnight. She reached for the switch. The light came on. The lens turned. The beam swept out across the water, touching the far shore, touching the trees, touching the dark and the stars and the great still expanse of the lake that her family had tended and loved for more than a century. She watched it go, and she thought, I am here. I am still here. I am home. Snow came to Millhaven in November, the first light snowfall, more gesture than commitment, the kind that dusts the pine branches and outlines the dock in white and turns the lake road into a Christmas card. Clara woke that morning and stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and watched the snow come down in the absolute quiet that snowfall brings, muffling the world, turning everything soft and possible. She had a book to send to her publisher. She had a home that needed winterizing. She had dinner plans with Owen on Friday and coffee with Walt on Saturday and a standing Sunday call with Diane and, sometime in December, a visit from Penny's parents, who apparently wanted to see the lighthouse restoration for themselves and were using the visit as an excuse to bring an alarming amount of food. She realized, a life. Not the life she'd had in Boston, with its speed and its distance and its beautiful, hollow sufficiency. A different one. One built on the somewhat old-fashioned but apparently necessary principle that a life is made from where you are and who you're with and what you tend. She went out onto the porch with her coffee and stood in the snow. Across the yard and down the path, the lighthouse stood white-capped in the new snow, its lamp dark at this hour but present, and real and part of the morning. She thought about her father climbing these steps. She thought about Franklin Ashford building the tower from stone in the 1890s because he refused to let people drown in a preventable dark. She thought about her mother keeping the dried lavender in every room and keeping the notebooks in a box with his name on it and saying, to a young woman with a red braid, that Clara would be back before long. She thought about the light sweeping across the water. She held her coffee in both hands. She stood in the snow, and she was grateful, simply, quietly, completely grateful, in the way you can only be grateful when you've been lost long enough to truly appreciate being found. The snow came down. The lake was still. The lighthouse stood at the end of the point like a promise that had been kept. And somewhere in the pine trees above the caretaker's cottage, a single bird began to sing, bright and clear and unhurried, as if the day were just beginning. Which, of course, it was. And that, friends, is the story of Clara Ashford, and the lighthouse, and the light that had been waiting. Some lights are patient that way. Some lights know exactly who they're burning for. Good night, Millhaven. Good night, Lantern Lake. And so we come to the quiet end of our story tonight. I hope this story brought you a little peace tonight. If it did, please subscribe to Lantern Lake Stories. We light a new lantern every week. We light a new lantern every week. Leave a comment and tell me what part stayed with you. And if you know someone who needs a quiet story, share this with them. Wherever you are tonight, I hope you sleep deeply and well. I'll see you next time beside the Lantern Lake. Good night.